You see arrogance. Freud would see something else. A little boy, trying to prove himself to a father he could never impress. And behind the power? A fear of weakness so deep, it had to be buried. The man who stands before us, gilded in golden towers and thunderous applause, is not merely a personality. He is a psychological artifact. When we look at power, we often mistake its garments for its essence. The loud voice, the imposing stance, the unwavering certainty. But Freud would gently remove our naive glasses. He would lead us beneath the marble floors, past the security guards of conscious presentation. Down there, in the basement of the psyche, he would point to the frightened child. The one desperately collecting trophies to place at his father's feet. We are quick to judge what we do not understand. We label narcissism without seeing the wound that birthed it. We mock insecurity without honoring its origins. This is not about politics. This is about the human condition. About what drives us, shapes us, and ultimately reveals us in every gesture we make. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "In every real man a child is hidden that wants to play." But what happens when that child was never allowed to play? What happens when that child was told that weakness is failure? That vulnerability is shame? That love is conditional upon winning? The psyche adapts. It constructs elaborate fortresses. It creates a persona so powerful, so bulletproof, that no one can see the trembling foundation beneath. We are all, to some extent, performing our healing. Acting out scripts written in childhood, desperately trying to rewrite endings that wounded us. The difference is only in magnitude, in visibility, in the stages we are given to enact our unconscious theater. Some people's internal struggles play out in living rooms. Others play out on the world stage, affecting millions. The ego, as Freud conceived it, is not simply vanity. It is a mediator between our primal desires and the demands of social reality. When that ego becomes inflated, it is rarely from excess love. More often, it is compensation for its absence. The shadow self contains everything we cannot accept about ourselves. The weakness, the fear, the inadequacy, all banished to the basement of consciousness. But what is hidden does not disappear. It grows in the dark. It finds expression in unexpected ways. It demands acknowledgement through its very denial. Consider the man who cannot admit mistake, who cannot show vulnerability, who measures his worth in concrete acquisitions and public victories. This is not strength. This is a soul in armor so heavy it cannot feel the sun. A psyche so defended it has forgotten what it's defending. Beneath the bravado lies a child who learned that to be small is to be nothing. That to lose is to be unloved. That to doubt is to invite abandonment. The father looms large in Freudian theory. He is the first authority, the original judge, the initial model of manhood against which a boy measures himself. When that father demands perfection, when he withholds approval, when he makes love contingent on achievement, the child does not simply grow up. He grows armor. He builds walls. He constructs a self-design never to feel the pain of that original rejection again. This is where the true tragedy lies. Not in the expression of narcissism, but in its origins. Not in the hunger for adoration, but in the starvation that preceded it. Imagine carrying your father's voice inside you always. A voice that says you are never enough. That weakness is unforgivable. That vulnerability is death. You would build an empire to silence it. You would seek constant validation to drown it out. You would create a character incapable of failure. And yet, the voice would remain. Whispering in quiet moments. Emerging in dreams. Driving you forward with a hunger that can never be satisfied. Carl Jung, who expanded on Freud's work, would point to the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world. Some personas become so fixed they calcify. They become prisons rather than protections. The person inside cannot remove the mask because they no longer know where the mask ends and they begin. The pursuit of greatness can be noble. But when it stems from unhealed wounds, it becomes a desperate race against inner emptiness. External achievements cannot heal internal fractures. Gold plating cannot strengthen a cracked foundation. Applause cannot warm a frozen heart. The paradox of the narcissistic wound is this. The more desperately one seeks adoration, the less capable one becomes of receiving genuine love. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. It demands that we remove our armor, that we show our scars, that we admit our limitations and fears. But for the wounded child who learned that weakness means abandonment, such vulnerability feels like suicide. The armor becomes both protection and prison. This is not to excuse harmful behavior. Understanding is not the same as exoneration. Psychological insight does not erase ethical responsibility. But if we wish to understand power, why some grasp for it so desperately, why some wield it so recklessly, we must look beneath the surface. We must see the frightened child beneath the roaring man. We must recognize the emotional poverty beneath the material wealth. In our collective shadow lies this truth: we are all, to varying degrees, performing our healing on the stages life provides us. Some performances are quiet, internal affairs. Others shape nations, economies, histories. The scale differs, but the underlying dynamics remain consistent. The human psyche seeks resolution. It attempts, sometimes clumsily, sometimes destructively, to solve the equations of early wounding. If you were never enough, you try to become everything. If you were never seen, you ensure you cannot be ignored. If you were never secure, you build fortresses. Consider the irony. Those most desperate for approval are often those least willing to admit they need it. Those most hungry for love most fiercely deny its importance. Eric Fromm wrote of the fear of freedom, how we often choose the certainty of chains over the terror of authentic existence. To truly exist is to risk rejection. To genuinely connect is to be vulnerable to abandonment. To honestly assess oneself is to confront one's limitations. For some, this risk feels too great. The armor becomes the self. The performance becomes the person. The wound becomes the identity. And so, the little boy who could never please his father becomes the man who must please everyone, and simultaneously, no one. He becomes both omnipotent and empty. Both grandiose and hollow. Both desperate for validation and contemptuous of those who provide it. This is the essence of what Freud called repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate our original wounds, seeking a different outcome. The child who was conditionally loved seeks conditional love from millions. The boy who was valued only for winning can never lose, even when defeat is evident. In the theater of politics, we often see only the performer, never the performance. We analyze policy without understanding psychology. But power is always personal before it is political. Authority is always autobiographical before it is ideological. Leadership always emerges from the leader's psyche. The man who needs to be perceived as invincible will never acknowledge vulnerability, in himself or in others. He will see compassion as weakness. He will interpret disagreement as betrayal. He will experience criticism as annihilation. Because these dynamics were established long before he entered public life. This is where collective wisdom becomes crucial. Where we must recognize that unhealed wounds, when given power, can wound entire nations. Where we must understand that psychological patterns established in childhood relationships inevitably manifest in professional and political relationships. If we wish to comprehend why some leaders cannot admit error, cannot display empathy, cannot tolerate dissent, we must look to their formative years. To the fathers who demanded perfection. To the environments that punished vulnerability. To the early lessons that love was conditional upon performance. This insight invites compassion without requiring acceptance. Understanding without necessitating approval. Recognition without demanding reconciliation. It allows us to see the humanity in those we might otherwise demonize. To recognize that behind the most imposing facade may lie the most profound fragility. If this perspective resonates with you, perhaps it's because you too have witnessed the power of unresolved wounds to shape a person's path. Perhaps you've seen how childhood messages continue to echo throughout adult lives. How we all, in our own ways, attempt to heal old hurts through new actions. The gift of psychological insight is not merely academic. It offers us a more nuanced way to understand both others and ourselves. It reminds us that behind the strongest defenses often lie the deepest vulnerabilities. that beneath the loudest proclamations often whisper the quietest doubts. The next time you witness someone desperate for admiration, consider what they might be compensating for. What absence they might be trying to fill. When you see someone unable to acknowledge fault, reflect on what early environment might have made such acknowledgement feel like annihilation. This doesn't mean abandoning discernment. It means enriching it with depth. Not replacing judgment with psychology, but informing one with the other. In our own lives, we might ask, what armor am I wearing? What early wounds am I still trying to heal? What childhood messages still dictate my adult choices? These questions invite us into a deeper relationship with ourselves. They offer us the freedom that comes only from self-awareness and self-acceptance. Perhaps the greatest wisdom Freud offered was not about others, but about ourselves. About the courage to look inward, to face our shadows, to acknowledge that we are all, in some measure, still responding to our earliest relationships, still seeking approval from ghosts, still fighting old battles. The true power lies not in denial but in recognition, not in projection but in integration, not in building walls but in healing wounds. What would Freud say about the man in the golden tower? He would say, look deeper. See the child behind the man. Recognize the wound behind the wall. And perhaps most importantly, he would urge us to turn that same compassionate insight inward. To find the wounded children within ourselves. To understand that our judgments of others often reveal our own unhealed places. Our own fears. Our own compensations. In the end, the most profound political act may be psychological integration. The courage to face our own shadows rather than projecting them onto others. To recognize that the line between narcissism and woundedness, between power and vulnerability, between strength and fear, is thinner than we imagine. We are all, in our own ways, trying to prove ourselves to someone. Trying to heal something. Trying to become whole. Some do it quietly. Some do it on the world stage. But the underlying human dynamics remain the same. The next time you see arrogance, try to see what Freud would see, the defense mechanism hiding a deeper vulnerability. The performative confidence masking profound insecurity. The desperate need for external validation concealing an absence of internal worth. And in that seeing, find not just understanding of others, but liberation for yourself. Freedom from the need to perform. Permission to be authentically human. For in the end, true strength lies not in the denial of weakness, but in its acceptance. Not in the fortress, but in the courage to live without walls.